Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I also rise to speak to the disallowance of social security administration declared income management areas, and I understand another 4 associated disallowance motions. I've just listened very carefully to Senator Seward, and as usual I know her as a very credible individual, and she speaks with great passion about the Indigenous communities. And the Greens are a political party that have a long-standing policy of opposing a policy whose genesis was a part of the Northern Territory emergency response. And I'm very pleased to see that Senator Crossan is also, the other senator for the Northern Territory, is also in the chamber, and I would hope she'd make a contribution to the debate today. It's one of those rare moments where we'll agree pretty much on everything, I hope, which is probably once a decade that we'd do that. But one would hope we have at least both parties have spoken along the same lines, and pretty much because we can speak with some confidence. When the Northern Territory emergency response legislation was first considered, obviously very, very controversial legislation, was introduced to the last year of the Howard government. I can recall assisting its passage, and I think it was the second longest debate in Federation. And I was Minister at the time. I took it through the place, and I understood it was very controversial. There were lots and lots of questions about what if and what would happen. And I can understand people's concerns about whether or not it had a net positive impact or not some time ago. It's really useful to have a look at the genesis. This was a response not because we decided that we'd just like people in the Northern Territory to have some assistance in managing their income. It came from what was quite clearly quite a shocking report. Evidence given in over 73 communities, evidence given freely and expertly in a particular way, and I think that's really the benchmark for taking evidence in many of these many of these communities, by witnesses, women, victims. And the report, amongst other things, reported systematic sexual abuse of children. Now, whilst that was the headline out of it, it made some very important links between chronic alcoholism and the dysfunctionality that follows that. The breakdown of law and order, and I'm talking about both customary law and mainstream law, and also the breakdown followed, of course, Mr Acting Deputy President, was the breakdown of what any human being would be considered the social norms. And of course, some of the evidence was quite clear. But why were the communities so dysfunctional? How come we had this level of breakdown of social norms, this sort of lack of responsibility from parents where they know where their kids are, just a whole horror story. And wherever we looked, there was alcohol. Wherever we looked, there was alcohol. And it was variously described by people from both sides of this place as the rivers of grog. Clearly, they had to stop. And again, there was quite a clear causal link between the availability of cash as a payment for invariably from New Start or some welfare payment in the community. Sadly, there are plenty of people, far too many people in the communities that are poor, and that's the circumstance. They're just simply poor, Mr Acting Deputy President, and there are far too many of them are reliant on a welfare payment. And of course, access to alcohol and other substances of abuse. I think the link has been clearly made. So the cash payments, therefore, had to be quarantined, or we'd like 50% of that had to be set aside. And what in fact it did was to ensure that 50% less or 50% reduction on the funds that were available to buy alcohol. It's very simple. A lot of people try to confuse it, but that was in effect what happened. 50% of the funds in the community, whether they were in your bank and taken out, were simply not available to buy alcohol. It wasn't available to buy cigarettes, it wasn't available to buy pornography, a whole range of annoying things like that. Cigarettes not so much, but the pornography thing, I think people were pretty embarrassed about that, and rightly so. Clearly the alcohol was the main motivation, was to stop the alcohol. And anecdotally, and my observations were quite startling. I saw changes in the communities that in the decade or so that I'd been travelling around many of the communities, particularly in Northern Territory, the effect was stark. Now, there's a couple of things. Those people, perhaps the Greens would argue, well, there was a number of things that may have caused that. It wasn't only the income quarantine, perhaps the provision of the 63 extra police officers, the Substance Abuse Intelligence Desk, and very intelligent applications of law enforcement and compliance to ensure that alcohol didn't get out of the community. Sure, that was all part of the Northern Territory emergency response legislation. But most importantly, the income quarantining led to a 50% reduction on the funds that could possibly use to purchase grog, gunja and other substances of abuse. Now, I think the real question when looking at this disallowance motion is whether it's more important to look and listen carefully, which it always is, to the Greens' position, or listen to what is overwhelmingly the position of the communities. And Mr Acting Deputy President, particularly the women in those communities who have been quite vocal and have made their position on this very, very clear. Now, I acknowledge to Senator Seaweed at the time, who would have known? As a parliament, often we think, well, this will be the solution. 5 years' time, we think, well, we probably could have tweaked that. And with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps that would have been the case. But I'm not so sure with this particular piece of legislation. I think we got it pretty much right. And I know there has been pockets of resistance, I would call them, that have resisted it. I think there's some pretty good evidence that counters that resistance. I think the first one was a joint study conducted by FAXIA and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And they looked at well, I can tell you it's got a lot more credibility than the Equality Rights Alliance, who were quoting to me a minute ago, Senator Seaweed. And if I can just afford me the decency that I afforded you, I'd most appreciate it. And so they went on to say there was income management. They were given three options: good, bad and undecided. The headline number here, that an objective study conducted by impartial assessors who had no vested interest in the communities that these measures targeted, is that double the number of respondents said income managed was good rather than bad. It's a very simple headline heading right across the communities. Now, there were a number of communities. Tennant Creek actually was just under 50-50, so it was only 46% of them said it was good. However, places like Gapawea and Arnhem Land said 92% responded good. Alpaterno and Fink in the Central Desert, 80% said it was good. I think the worst one in terms of our side of the argument, Niue and the Tiwi Islands, only 23% of them said it was good. But overall, the headline number was that double the number of respondents said it was good rather than bad, literally, and exactly twice as many of the people who get income managed. And I would have thought that it was those individuals who would know best. And in fact, on the 25th of August, we had a change of government in the Northern Territory, and whilst that's probably unremarkable, I think there's three of the people who were elected in the southern end of the Northern Territory, or two in the southern end and one sort of in the middle, were three women. One was re-elected and the other two were new candidates who were elected. They were Bess Price, Alison Anderson and Larissa Lee, and certainly through Bess and Larissa and my relationship through that process, we often discuss these matters, as you would. You know, I said some compelling arguments from people. They were all saying we've done the wrong thing, all these sort of things. And I have to say, Senator Seaweed, I don't think we get too much argument from yourself, but I would have thought that people like Bess Price, Alison Anderson and Larissa Lee, who are Aboriginal women who have spent much time in these communities, not only visiting, with respect to my colleague on the other side that we tend to do. I'd love to say that I do more than that, but I certainly haven't lived in them in the same way that they have. They're born, brought up in these communities, and they certainly are able to reflect on the before and the after. And I have to say, I've been very, very impressed with the answers that I get. Certainly the Greens can't put the hand on their heart and to claim to have more experience on Indigenous issues, more experience of life in the bush, remote areas of the Northern Territory than Ms Price, Ms Anderson and Ms Lee. The reason I make the point about this, there has been a bit of a question about, well, what do people in the Northern Territory think about the intervention? Well, There was possibly other issues, perhaps one other issue with the Shire, to be honest, but I think if you ever needed a plebiscite on income management or then the intervention, which was a bad and dastardly thing, there was quite... The election, certainly in Best Price electorate, certainly in Alison Anderson's electorate, was fought on the basis of the intervention. If you'll get more of the intervention if you vote for Alison Anderson. You'll get more of the intervention if you vote for Best Price. Not so much with Larissa, there was a number of other issues. And they voted for them in their droves. 18% swing for Bess with a concerted process. And I think, and there was a number of other issues, I don't want to distract from this particular issue, but I think in Central Australia, given the debate and given the issues that were canvassed there, particularly by the First Nations Party and the Greens, who ran a single issue about this is all about the intervention, you don't need any more intervention. Well, it was a clear plebiscite. No one voted for it. No one. Well, close as damn it to no one. I don't want to be misrepresented. There was a couple of people. Obviously lost on the day. But it's a clear plebiscite on this issue. And those are individuals whose life revolves around whether or not their income is quarantined or not. They got a choice to give they gave a choice to give some sort of a mandate, whether they wanted it or not, and they spoke out and very clearly. So I was speaking actually to Bess a few weeks ago, and she shared with me some of her perspectives about Indigenous culture. Now, she grew up with descendants from pre-white settlement. It's very hard to imagine in our context, even in here, that there are people alive today, but that's how remote these places are. So she knew as a young woman people who predated, people wandering in the Land Rover and helping people out. And she's able to help me understand, as have many of my Indigenous friends, why it is that we have this demand share system, as we call it, in the Indigenous communities. Often it was the case that when you got food, you're culturally obliged to share it with your kin, and there's a very practical reason for that. If we have a kangaroo, we don't put half it in the fridge or eat a foot and put the rest of it away. There's just simply not that opportunity. There's no fridges for storage. So we have to eat it all now. And the demand share system effectively deals with that circumstance and says, well, this is how you separate it, this is how you deal with it. This is uncle. When uncle asks you for something, you've got to give it to him. There's a whole range of cultural processes around that. Very practical cultural processes. But sadly, the notion of property and sharing hasn't translated well into a modern cash-based economy where one person has a resource and the obligation to use that now, even if they're trying to save, is very difficult, and its translation, sadly, is lost in that circumstance. So if you imagine for a moment a woman who's raising a family, she gets a pension or New Start payment as a cash deposited into her account. There are plenty of people in her extended family, in fact in the township, including some of those who have a substance abuse problem, so how they spend their money sometimes is also not a choice. Now she's obliged to help. Now if she refuses, it's a serious matter. And it's not a serious matter later, it's a serious matter now. Someone's instructing you to provide something to him or her to meet their cultural obligations. And that makes it very, very difficult. Sometimes if they break those laws, you can be vulnerable to not only verbal abuse, assault, isolation in the community. It's a very serious thing. So it's not our nation of humbug. Look, I just wonder if I can borrow you a tenner till Friday. It's nothing like that at all. And it makes it very, very hard for those people who wish to break out. But look, let's have a quick look at what happened when we introduced the basics card. And I don't about down the Central Desert, but certainly I've spent a fair bit of time recently after its introduction in some of the more northern coastal communities, and not right across the board, but I can still remember the difference in many of the women who understood what was happening with it. So when someone came and started humbugging, they'd say something, basic card, yaka rupiah. I've got no, there's no cash, and it was an answer to someone who was humbugging them. It became just an answer, basic card. They've cut off the yaka rupiah because they're basic card, nothing. And so they are far better off in that situation, and I can tell you that the beneficiaries very much have been those people who used to be the victims. If I can refer again to the AI HW report of 2009, and there are dozens of measures that look at, or bench measures taken about the effectiveness of welfare quarantine. I'll just go through a couple of them. So it's not only about money, it's about whether you have capacity to have cash for alcohol. Some of the other benefits, participants were asked if their families were eating more fresh fruit and vegetables, and this isn't storekeepers, this was participants in the Institute of Health and Welfare report. 56.9% said yes, only 8.3% said no. Vandalism was reported as going down, 18% less. Violence in the streets, 29% less. 47% reported feeling more safe. 47% of people reported feeling safer in their communities. It's something we guess I take for granted, but I think that's pretty significant. 66% say children are being better looked after. 60% say alcohol and drug abuse is down. 52% report humbugging down. 63% say there is less gambling. And Best, again, told me of one man in a family group. She says a man looks after 6 children and said, welfare quarantine saved my life. It's as simple as that. Welfare quarantining saved my life. I'm able now, even in a cultural sense, to say, look, I've got to look after these kids. I've only got this much cash. Humbug me for some of that, but the rest of it is going to be food for the kids. So I actually did a survey myself in a community of Wadair. It's had its challenges in the past. It's gone through some in the last couple of weeks. It has had challenges with alcohol, violence, gangs in the past. I went to when I went to Wadair the last time I spent a bit of time there. I commissioned a survey, and it was a bit of a different survey. I actually hired local people who spoke the local language, and I asked them to find out what the people in Wadair thought about a number of issues, and the basics card was one of them. Now, they had 4 options on how they rate the basics card. Really good, good, okay and bad. So nearly 48% said really good. That's top marks, 48%. 73% rated it either good or really good. I think it's a pretty significant statistic. And I think that the result of that is that money isn't being wasted funding the addiction of your friends and kin. Money's actually being spent looking after children. Money's being spent on food and shelter. Now, when the Greens stand up in this place and claim to be acting in the interests of Indigenous people, 73% of people in Wadair support the basics card, and in that plebiscite, 0.7% of the people in Wadair voted for the Greens candidate at the last election. Indigenous women in the APY lands have been calling for welfare quarantining for a couple of years. Now, they've seen the effects of the basic card across the border. They've seen the reduction in humbug. They've seen the kids getting fed. They've seen the women and elderly say that they're safer, and they've actually been asking for welfare quarantining to come into the Northern Territory. So they've been able to observe. They're not subject to it, but they are subject to discussions with their peers. They are subject to discussions with individuals who they know and trust. And they say, what's this about? Is this about what the Greens tell us? Is this about, this was introduced by a government to punish people? They'd say, yucca, that, nothing. They'd say, this is here to help us, because the benefit is when you're helping, the help that comes to us is simply because we don't get the cash anymore. And as a mother, principally, as a mother, we're able to know that the welfare that comes to me, to my husband and our family, half of that money has to be used for things like rent and food and clothing and all those sort of issues that we take for granted. So I know that this has been an ongoing issue for the Greens, and I represent, I think, everyone in the Northern Territory, particularly the Indigenous people in the Northern Territory, when I say that they don't support it. Aboriginal people who are subject to this legislation, who are subject to welfare quarantining, do not support the disallowance of this motion. And so it's never too late to change your mind from the Greens. It's never too late to actually represent the people you claim to represent. Because if you are at cross purposes to anyone in this debate, you are at cross purposes to those representatives you purport to represent in the centre of Australia.